Hello and welcome to Angel's Costumes Behind the Seams. I'm Jeremy Angel.
And I'm Jonathan Lippman.
And I'm Richard Green. And today I'm very pleased to be introducing my interview or my chat with Alex Fordham. Alex, another ex-member of staff. I love the way that so many people that work for us go out and do things and then come back again in a different, slightly different form.
He's very highly respected by the people that work with him because he brings an awful lot of knowledge and creativity to the project. And I think that what's been really interesting about Alex's career is he's always been able to play to his best strengths. I don't think there have been many occasions when he's been out of his comfort zone in terms of knowledge and creativity, which is a well-planned career, because it means you're never in a terrible panic and you're never sort of responding badly to the pressures that this industry ordinarily places upon you.
And he does always sort of exude a sense of calm and peace about it. I mean, I know he's good at his job, but there's not a lot of that sort of flapping around that sometimes happens, is there?
It seeps into everyone else as well, because he's so calm when he comes to an appointment. No one else is getting stressed, even though the deadlines are looming. So it's a very good, but it's also quite disconcerting, because it's you forget suddenly, everything's going tomorrow. Why is he so calm?
Angels, we won't make a crisis out of your drama.
Something to do with cricket, I think.
Well, I think that's probably it. Actually, you're right, Jonathan. It's the long game, isn't it? It's not over. It's not over in 90 minutes like a football game. It's a 3-dayer that he's always playing. Yeah.
What I find interesting with Alex is it's one of the things you discussed before, Richard, about the different avenues people seem to go to get into costume. That you get some people who go off to university and study, other people who start working, others who do the costume route. And he did do the university route, but he didn't do a university for costume. It was more the history side. So
that's right. I mean, as you'll hear in the interview, he wasn't actually even coming for a job as a costumier when he turned up for an interview. So
it was a bit like being pushed over the doorstep by our mothers.
Well, yet another one who answered an advert in the Evening Standard.
Just go and get a job.
But it's also another great thing of the fact that there is not a particular there's not one thing of you need to have this to work in costume, and it's just an interest in the history for Alex. Or
that is the one thing.
Yeah,
you've got to be interested in history. You've got to be interested in character, and you've got to be interested in stories.
And it helps if you're not colourblind.
Have there ever been any colourblind designers or?
I'm not sure about designers, but I can think of at least one wardrobe person. At least wardrobe person that we both know and love, whose name begins with Dave. Colourblind.
But military makes it easier to be colourblind.
It's all grey.
Because the interesting thing is, I never realised Alex never worked in the military department here. I always thought, from when I've known Alex, obviously I never knew him at the office. I've only known him when he was away from Angels. I didn't realise he never worked in the military department. It's just something he enjoys and takes, has a passion for. And that's because he's he knows his military, even though he wasn't trained specifically in military.
No, that's right. I mean, he's basically what we used to call a period men's costumier. Do that sort of, well, as you hear in the interview.
We hope you've been enjoying these conversations. We've certainly been enjoying your feedback. If you have any questions or people you'd like us to interview, please email us at podcast@angels.co.uk. You can visit our website, which is www.angelsbehindtheseams.com, or you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We are /costume podcast. And here is Richard's chat with Alex Fordham.
Hello, my name is Richard Green, and today I have the pleasure and privilege to be talking to Mr. Alex Fordham, or Lord Fordham as I sometimes know him. Alex, good morning.
Morning, Richard. Hello.
How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Yes, very good.
Good. I don't want to start these conversations with the fact that we seem to have had technological problems, but we're over them now, which is why I always sound so happy, because it's actually...
You finally made it happen.
Yeah, it's a relief that you and I have made it happen. And it took 3 phone calls and a couple of Skype conversations. And I'm still confused about the fact that there is another Alex Fordham somewhere in London who's expecting to have a Skype call with me at some point. But anyway, you're here now.
Who has a Postman Pat icon?
A Postman Pat, and yes, Postman Pat and his black and white cat icon.
Yeah.
So I far prefer yours of you in India. So basically, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to do this. And I'd like to start first of all by the usual question. How did you find yourself in the position you are now?
Well, I finished university and I'd waiting for my results.
You read history?
I read history, yes. It was early modern history at London University. And I was waiting for something to I needed something to just keep me occupied. And I saw an advert for a research librarian, North London. I thought, well, that's quite good. That might be tick over sort of stuff. But it also had Bermans and Nathan's written as the place where the library was. And I thought, I know that name because I'd seen their names on the ends of films.
Right, okay. Yep,
like the Three Musketeers or something like that. And I thought, oh, well, that's familiar because I was mad about movies. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I was interviewed by a lovely man called George Bennett that you'll remember.
Yes, indeed.
And he,
like you'd never believe.
Yeah, exactly. And he was delightful.
Was George in the library at that point? Because when I worked with him, he was first of all deputy head of the uniform department, and then he became head of uniform department when Bob Worth got moved up a step. Was George in the library at the point?
George was in the library. I think they'd had a lady called Kate Izzard, I think, had been in the library before that, and they wanted somebody to have a go at that. But what happened was that I went for the chat and they said, yes, wonderful. Got a reply saying, we'd like you to start, but actually, would you come and see us one more time? And I thought, okay. So I went up to Camden and I was taken upstairs to the second floor where the men's period department was. And I was surrounded by these sort of aspidistras and ancient furniture and an extraordinary sort of baronial feel with all these rails of endless tabards and stuff. I thought, wow. And they said, we think you'd be good in the library, but we'd actually like to try you on the costume floor. And I said, I have no idea how to do costume whatsoever. They said, but you know what things look like from your history. I was like, whoa. So I thought I'd have a go.
And the rest, as they say.
Well, within a couple of weeks, you found yourself down a rail measuring breeches as usual. And doing all the bits and pieces. But very shortly after that, they started putting me onto little small productions, and I thought, well, this is quite good fun actually.
So let me recap this. And the reason I asked this is because at least 3 of us answered adverts in the Evening Standard for somebody for Bermans and Nathan's. Was it in the Evening Standard?
I think it was.
So that's how we all kind of got sucked in.
Yeah, I'd been messing around with Foyle's Bookshop. You see, I'd been kind of doing some stuff with Foyle's Bookshop, and of course, sitting on the train. I was avidly reading the Evening Standard and saw this advert. Yeah.
So there you are. You go to Camden. You get into reception. There's all the shields and all that stuff around there. They take you up to the first floor, which is where the library was, I think, wasn't it? And,
first floor library, second floor men's period. Yeah.
Yeah. I funny enough, I thought that the second floor was uniforms and third floor was.
Oh no, you're right. You're right. It's just when Tim took over, actually, we moved it down. I think
we swapped it all.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We did indeed, indeed. So that's your introduction. So you mentioned the fact that you've been watching films, Three Musketeers and things like that, and those 70s productions of costume that they did so well.
Yeah.
But you had obviously, presumably, no intention of joining the costume business. Like me, you're a historian, and academia was of interest, and historical. Yeah. Reading was of interest, but applying that to costume wasn't something that occurred to you any more, I guess, than it did to me.
No, I think it was one of those things where, like you're drawn into it because it has associations with what you've studied and what you're interested in, which is why I thought I'd give it a go. And I never expected to be put on the costume floor. I thought I'd be filing or doing book stuff, and then maybe think about a more academic career after that, but I was fascinated with it actually, and because it was able to combine movies, and I could touch the clothes that I'd seen in the film Cromwell, one of my amazingly favourite films, because I'd studied the English Civil War and 17th century history. This was where I was most at home, and in fact the first job I got was a little three-hander called Faces of Cromwell. And it was an amazing old actor who'd been in a series called By the Sword Divided, which those of us at university were besotted with, because it was running almost at the time that I joined Bermans. And it was a little three-hander with Lely painting him, the painter Sir Peter Lely painting him. And it was just an extraordinary little thing. I thought,
warts and all, presumably.
Warts and all. And I got him into Richard Harris's costume from Cromwell. So that was kind of...
I know. It's little triumphs, isn't it? When you kind of do that. When you, I mean, it interests me very much, this sort of cross fertilization, with history and costume, because obviously, George Bennett was quite right when he spotted your potential. If you know the dates of the Civil War, if you know that the First World War is 1914 to 1980, and all those things, you almost subliminally apply that.
Yes.
You can put costume into context, if you like, into its historical context.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of my study at university had actually been criticised slightly by one of my lecturers, saying that you're too keen on art history, because I was always writing essays about royal imagery and stuff. So I had a very focused idea of what periods looked like. I wasn't a dry... illustration-free historian. I was very keen on the cultural myths that history gave me, so I could listen to music, look at paintings, read literature. And it seemed to me that, movies were very much part of that in our interpretation of the past, which is why I was quickly drawn into the whole fascination of working in a costume house.
And you were in the men's period department, of course, which basically went up to what?
About 1870, something like that.
That's right. Yeah. And then after that, the men's modern department came in.
But the irony was that it was always considered a specialist department, despite the fact that it covered from biblical to 1870. And somehow we were specialists. It was like, really? We're covering some 900 years of history.
Pretty broad canvas, isn't it, really?
It's very odd.
Just a slight digression. Did you ever have the Ladybird history books when you were a kid?
I did, and I was mad about them, especially because they had a very particular style of illustration that I later found out had no relevance whatsoever to period costume.
No, but on the other hand, the thing, the connection that I made, I love those books.
Yeah.
Although, interestingly, I was thinking about this the other day, they didn't go any further than Queen Victoria.
No.
She decided, that the 20th century wasn't of interest to anybody in the 1950s, 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I think anybody who had a faintly imperial sense of history knew that it ended at the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, and that was the end of it.
But I'm thinking really of the format with those incredible illustrations, those colour illustrations, which, as you say, sometimes were a little bit kind of off true.
Well, all I remember was very clearly one about the Pilgrim Fathers or something, and there was this bevy of men with sort of croppy haircuts, big sugarloaf hats, huge white collars, and a sort of floppy jacket. And you thought, well, that's not absolutely correct. you realise that reality had more to offer than just that.
Yeah, the one I was just visualising, as you mentioned, it was the Cromwell one, with those sort of buff-coated round heads and iron sides. And things.
Yeah, that's right. And it's funny because also I wasn't into this, but where I was at school in High Wycombe, there had been regular demonstrations by the Sealed Knot and stuff, who all had much more interesting reenactor stuff, but much more interesting to look at. And the spectacle was, although it wasn't framed and filmed, it was not far off from the idea of seeing this stuff alive on real people.
Yeah, and the smell of musket smoke.
Smell of muskets, drape of flags, and all that stuff.
Yes, the beat of drum.
Yeah.
So you're working there, and I know that you were there when Bermans was sold and Angels bought them, and we moved into Camden as well. You were very much a part of that costume department then, for a long time.
Yeah.
But at a point, you decided to strike out on your own, and I can't remember the first one you worked in, but I do know that you worked with Mike O'Neill quite a lot.
I did work with Mike O'Neill. Oddly, in my time at Bermans, I'd spent most of my time actually working with French designers. I spoke French, so I was encouraged to work with those, and we did an awful lot of revolutionary stuff for that bicentenary. But yes, I'd also met Mike, and I knew Mike very well. Done a couple of shows through the house with him. I'd been sent to Paris by Tim when we had the operation in Paris with Sam, who was his partner.
Yeah.
And I'd learnt so much from Mike. And so, yes, he encouraged me to leave. But the first thing I did was actually a thing called Esther Kahn with Gordon Harmer and Natalie Dearings. But yes, I then worked with Mike for the next couple of years. Yeah.
And I mean, I can't remember the production now, but I remember Tim and I went out to see Mike at Alexandra Palace.
Yeah.
There was some location going over there, and it was a period Victorian production, and he was in despair because the director had decided he didn't want hats on people.
Yes.
And we'll come to that in a wee while, because again, but bringing it up slightly up to date, of course, this whole sort of English Civil War, Christopher Hill, Lawrence Stone, preconditions, preceptions and triggers and all that stuff, stands you in good stead when you start to do things like The Devil's Whore.
Yes, every now and again you get an opportunity to do something that's right up your alley, that is particularly, I mean, I'm interested in all history, obviously, but something that's really close to home. We had it with Charles II, with Mike O'Neill. We did amazing BBC four-parter about Charles II, which was in heaven doing that. Yeah. Marvellous. Devil's Whore, absolutely. And also particularly fascinating because it was a very contemporary writer, Peter Flannery, had written it, Our Friends in the North writer. But it was so alive with an extraordinary cast. A lot of people like Michael Fassbender and Dominic West quite early on in their
I was going to say, before they became part of the great and good.
And it was extraordinary.
Greater and gooder.
Yeah, we had an amazing time putting that together. Not a lot of money, and of course we had to do it in South Africa, which meant logistics and making, but through people we didn't know. So we had a lot of hires from you guys to try and, which they weren't interested in having because they thought we could all do it in South Africa. So not only was it a great period, but it also was an extraordinary introduction in how to get things done in really quite faraway places that you're not used to. It was very much a learning process, and I think it came off quite well. But yeah, to do the 17th century around Oxfordshire, an amazing story. It was a joy.
Now, of course, that was with Michele Clapton.
It was.
Although that wasn't the first thing you'd done with her. You did Casanova with Michele before that, didn't you?
Yeah, Casanova was back in 2005, and I was on holiday in Prague with my partner. We met on Charles II in Prague, and we were going back to do a little anniversary trip. And I hadn't taken my phone, and I was told, ring your messages, because you could do that on a landline. And I found a message from a friend saying, call Michele Clapton now. She needs to speak to you about a job. So I said, oh, Christ, right, okay. So I rang her and said, where are you? And I said, well, I'm in... And I'd known Michele for a long time. I'd never done a show with her at Bermans or Angels, but I'd known her a long time.
You'd known her what, just sort of socially?
Or as a client. Yeah. You know, she'd often been in, and I'd always been raving about her fabulous Citroen. We'd met car socially and stuff. So, and it was great. And she obviously thought, and it was interesting, Casanova was a project that Mike had heard about as well. Michele got it. She asked me to... Mike O'Neill, yeah. But she asked me to join the thing, and she had another person called Anna Lau, and she basically said to Anna and myself, who wants to be the assistant designer and who wants to be the supervisor? And I said, well, I think if I'm sort of the 18th century man, maybe I should be the assistant designer. And Anna was fine with that, and Michele was fine with it, and away we went.
Right. And that, as they say...
And that started a very long and wonderfully rewarding relationship that I've had with Michele now for, not exclusively, but we like to job around a bit.
No, and again, that's something that I want to sort of elaborate a little bit on, because you can name the shows as well as I can, but The Crown, Game of Thrones, etc. So it's been a good collaborative relationship. I guess it's fair to say, wouldn't you?
Yes, I think that's the most wonderful thing about it. We come from very different angles, in the sense that I started off being Mr. Authentic with a K, that you can't put that cuff on that and you can't do this.
Yeah, I remember. Alex.
Yeah, it's a bit painful. The shoulders on that just absolutely not right.
The waistcoat won't fit this actor, but it's absolutely marvellous for the character of the period.
Yes. Honestly, can't we just make a new back?
Yes, just make a new back for it.
And Michele came from much more of a sort of stylist, a commercials background, but we found a mutual love of drama, and we found that we could play off each other really well, and it meant that you brought two things to the design of a show rather than just one, and that's why I think it's worked quite well.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, actually, isn't it? Because there are the two facets there. Instead of just having a designer who goes, well, this is my style, this is what I want, it's kind of tempered by your historical eye, your eye for accuracy and detail and authenticity.
Yes, I think the great thing about Michele is that she has such vivid imagination, such wonderful sense of what clothes are capable of, because she can make things. She knows that stuff inside out. What's happened is that I think that I've shown her what historical clothes are capable of too. They're not always quite as tame or as authentic as people imagine. When we did Casanova, we looked at some of the references, and some of the stuff, I think we looked at the Swedish Royal Collection, it was almost like Lurex, 18th century version of it. So and vivid purples and pinks and things. So it was the fact that we opened each other out to our take on stuff and found a way to incorporate Michele's extraordinary concepts with some historical detailing that is fascinating, and that she took on. And in a way, we've almost reversed positions, is that she's concerned to get the period right, and I'm much more, let's make it, let's do something slightly more interesting. I mean, it's fun. It's such fun.
And it is an extraordinarily strong partnership and relationship. But you're quite clear in your mind, aren't you, that Michele is the designer. I mean, you're now credited, I think, as assistant designer on a lot of these things.
I think so. I was associate designer on the last season of Thrones, and I think I've got some peculiar title on the Kingsman.
Yes, there's a prize for the best person who can guess what that peculiar title might be. I have a few ideas of my own, but
it's only 2 lines long. It's fine. I think it's very much the case that Michele is the designer. What is exciting is that she gets very interesting work, which means that there's always a fascinating challenge ahead. But yes, I mean, an assistant designer is really there to make sure that the designer's concepts get to screen. They will have all their tussles with directors. We will have conversations with actors in fittings. The process is quite clear cut. But in between all of that, when you're talking about how you're going to pull it off and how you assess those characters, that's where the real assistant work comes in. Is that I often have this thing that I'm a bit like Sergeant Wilson. Is that wise? And we laugh about it. Sort of. I'm going to do. Is that wise? And I think it is. An assistant has to do that sometimes. But obviously, yes, the designer is the designer, and you have to. The evolution of it is the exciting thing, and it's getting their ideas to the screen is what you're there for.
Yeah. And I mean, I know from personal experience how extremely hands-on you are in big chunks of these productions. Anyway, I mean, The Crown obviously is a classic example of that, where basically you and I and Tom, who was head of uniform at the time, and Angela, of course, were heavily involved in recreating both the individuals and also those big set piece scenes that I spoke to Giles about previously. The matching it in with the newsreel and things, and that's stuff you love, isn't it? I mean, it's stuff that I love, but it really gets you going as well.
I find it utterly fascinating. I mean, they are, after all, just clothes, and they are things that you research like you would research anything else. But The Crown, yes, you're right. That was very much a collaborative affair. In a way, that was such a heavy burden because Giles and all the people who worked on The Crown in its various guises know that it is not that long to get any of it done. And sometimes script changes and so forth. But we had a very strong structure. We had a coronation, 2 funerals, a wedding, and various other bits and pieces to do. So that clarifies it quite easily. But it was all the smaller things, the equerry. Does he have the correct things on the shoulder? We had a historical advisor, Major David Rankin Hunt, who was a joy and a boon at the same time.
Because that isn't always the case, is it?
It's not always the case. I think, and I think basically on The Crown, Michele was very, very, very occupied with the Queen, with Princess Margaret, with Queen Mother, Mrs. Simpson. We had a lot of stuff, and I was hoovering up all of that. But of course, it wasn't just the uniforms; it was all the civilian stuff as well. The government, non-stop. But the trick with that job was knowing from the first reading where you needed to go and get stuff ready, which meant piling in and getting every kind of suit you could possibly think, every kind of piece of mourning wear you could possibly think of, and then talking to you guys about court coats, about uniforms, about equerries, all of that sort of thing. And that gets you ahead. If you have to do all that from scratch and work out what they are, then you are much slower and it's going to be much, much more difficult. Luckily, we were ready for all of that and we got on with it as soon as we knew we were doing it.
I mean, I suppose the difference between that and some of the other productions that you've worked on is the fact that you know the period that you actually be going betwixt and between. You know, as you say, that there are two weddings and a funeral, or 2 funerals and a wedding, or or was it 4?
Rather grander than those, but
yes. So you've got those big set pieces coming up. What you don't know, of course, is the numbers and where the location's going to be and all of those things. But at least you got that. Whereas on some of the other productions, and I'm thinking perhaps of Kingsman, where you're getting script rewrites and you're getting things that are being thrown at you from left field.
Yes, it's quite. I think. Well, even The Crown, there was a very memorable day. Everyone will know. Maybe they don't, but lots of script rewrites come in different colours, and we'd been through the colour palette about 3 times. We were 2/3 of the way through, and there was one afternoon where you randomly scan through and sort of go, oh yeah, okay, it's doing that. And there was this little line saying, a masked ball takes place in the background. And he thought, I beg your pardon.
Blink and you missed the line.
Blink and you missed it. I mean, it was literally one line, and it potentially could have cost us £10,000 to try and do it. But as it turned out, we did it with evening dress and face. But you're right. There are moments where you are going to get stuck. Most nice productions tend to flag it up and say, would this be okay? Will you be capable of doing that? Otherwise, it's the supervisor yelling down the phone at somebody going, what?
When?
How many? I mean, by and large, of course, you have no choice. If the production wants that, you have to find a way to do it. That was the same with Thrones. You have to have hundreds and hundreds of these things, and if they want 15 repeats, you have to find them. So, yes, Kingsman was interesting because that was a very fantastical script, but with a very period accurate and uniform accurate brief.
Yeah.
So you had to make sure that if you were doing British infantry on the Western Front, they were proper. If you were doing French infantry shooting Mata-Hari, you had to do those correctly. Austrians, all the rest of it.
Yeah. And again, I mean, that was a nice one for well, certainly for me, I think I was going to say it's a nice one for us because, you know, it had Boer War, it had Kitchener, it had concentration, you know, the first concentration camp. Not that those are nice, I'm not saying that, but that period of history, which isn't that well known, perhaps now.
I think that's very true. I think when I first heard about the show, when Michele said she'd got the show, I looked at it and thought, well, there are not many films for somebody who's interested in period clothes, especially period uniforms, who will do the Boer War, French, British, Russian, Austrian, a German submarine crew. I mean, it had everything in one show. Americans, we had to do those Americans, you remember?
Yes.
And then Matthew said, I don't like khaki. had to do them as Marine Corps in an afternoon.
Yes.
But no, I mean, it was fascinating, and I think not many shows give you that kind of opportunity, and therefore, however busy and hectic it was a fascinating journey, and well, people will judge whether it was pulled off or not, but it was an amazing opportunity, and it was thanks, of course, to Michele for getting the gig.
Yeah. While we're still talking about you and Michele, you know, you have said to me that assistant designer is a role that you're very comfortable and happy with. Is that the case?
No. I mean, yes.
No.
Obviously it is.
Oh, silly old me. It must have been a moment I wasn't listening to you.
No. It's very much so. I think, as I say, you know, I think designers are under tremendous pressure. You know, they have to, you know, agents and getting jobs and all the rest of it. An assistant designer, especially one like me who's managed to forge a really wonderful working relationship with a designer, means that you know you do quite nice work. Michele gets quite nice work, quite interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And the way we work together, the way she listens to me, the way I have a certain input, but also the fun of our creativity together, means that I'm not missing out on anything. I'm not missing out on possibly standing and getting my own BAFTA or anything like that. I don't think in those terms. I love the work that we do together. I like the team that we have got around us, or several teams actually over the years from different shows. So there's a great pool of people who make up our mob, as it were. And then you meet, for example, on Kingsman, again, we had a different supervisor and her team, many of whom were people I'd last seen when I worked at Bermans, for goodness sake, back in the 80s. So there is a wonderful group of people. So you once you're comfortable and you feel respected for what you do, ambition or the desire to be top dog doesn't enter into it.
No, and I think that's very profound. And I'm not for one moment suggesting it's a lack of ambition or a lack of confidence. You know, you've worked with other people. You are more than capable of rowing your own boat without any problem at all. And I was quite struck by the fact that, you know, you feel you're in the right place for you. It works for you. It obviously works very well for the people that work with you. And it's quite refreshing to actually have that. There was a wardrobe supervisor that we both know, and I'm not going to name her, but who spent most of her time telling everybody who'd listen that she could do a far better job than the designer on whichever production it was. One of the old school ones. Of course, you know, I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have done it, but
well, I think I might even know who you mean. Actually, I think certainly the difference with Michele and her team is that over the years we're quite a young group of people. Myself notwithstanding, being mid-50s, I mean, there is a broad group of people who are quite young, and one of the great pleasures has been seeing how the youngsters come through. I mean, the classic for that was, of course, Northern Ireland on Game of Thrones, where probably 80% of the crew were from Northern Ireland, and of that 80%, something like 90% had barely been on movies or television. And the joy of seeing those people grow into those tasks through a little bit of care and supervision and an interesting blend of people at the top was one of the most thrilling parts of the job I've ever enjoyed. And Northern Ireland's film industry now is testament to that great talent pool there that had never been tapped before. So I think the days of, well, I could have done better, of course, I think are long gone, luckily, certainly in our mob.
Yes, I mean, it certainly was a very destructive sort of approach to filmmaking.
And I think it was very stratified as well. It meant that certain people who were friends and relatives got the same gigs over and over again, which is fine if you're good enough. And sometimes people, I don't think, were quite good enough. Nowadays, I think up until very recently, of course, I think our film industry, our television industry certainly has been as busy as I can ever imagine it to have been. It's been extraordinary. The number of projects people could almost pick and choose from, be they cutters, be they jewelers, be they leather workers, be they crowd fitters. The variety and scale of the work up until now has been extraordinary, which has meant a lot of people in our business.
And it is interesting as well that a lot of the people that you and Thrones trained are now appearing in their own right and doing productions in their own right, both in Northern Ireland and over here as well. So that's can only be a good thing, I think.
I think it is, especially bearing in mind they're all quite young. We have a wonderful assistant designer, Emma O'Loughlin, who's one of the Northern Irish crew. There's a great friend of mine, Ashley Lennox, who's out there doing her thing as well. There are very good people who've come through that system. Some obviously only want to stay in NI, but a lot of them are spreading their wings, and to have that sort of injection of young talent, I think, is a joy.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to this historical accuracy because, as we've said, you and I both have history degrees. We come from a period where it matters, getting it right matters. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that in our careers, we've always striven to do what we can in the correct way. And of course, then along came history with a twist.
Or my favourite, let's give it a contemporary feel, which I think was I first heard in about 1999. And people are still saying it, and you sort of think, well, there you are.
We said about Mike and the director who didn't want Victorian gentlemen wearing hats at all and things like that. But I mean, obviously, ultimately, the customer is right. In my case, it's you. In your case, it's the director or the costume designer, whoever. But it does strike me that it's kind of a license to get things, or not worry about the accuracy of things sometimes. So sometimes I can imagine that there are valid points for giving it a twist because it approaches it from a new angle, and you suddenly think, oh my God, I'm thinking perhaps of Mary Queen of Scots with those black kilts with the pockets on that Alex did.
I think, to be honest, the one thing I've learned, and this is partly Michele's influence, her freedom of spirit, as it were, is that there are two things that are really important. One is consistency. Too many times you'll see productions where the top cast have a twist and everybody else is in standard issue hires. Yeah. And the thing doesn't work. When you get really good versions of twist, which are thorough and consistent, like Taboo, for example, when Joanna Eatwell did Taboo, that is fantastic from top to bottom. Because everybody, every character, every extra is thought about. So consistency to me is one thing, very important. So you can twist as much as you like as long as you twist everyone.
Yes, twist and shout. No, you're quite right. I mean, there's nothing...
With or without pockets.
There's nothing more jarring, is there? You're right. The money for the twist has been spent on the people in the front of the camera, but we're filling the background with a bit of
with your standard issue costume-mongers or whatever it is. Now that's the first point. The second point about authenticity is that authentic clothes are often more interesting than the imagination. We found on Casanova that they were perfectly capable of finding an 18th century coat with a leopard print collar and cuffs, cut steel, jeweled buttons and tassels on the tail. There are as many authentic items of fascination as there are twist possibilities. So my interest has always been to find the most interesting period pieces, to show its breadth, to show the variety, to show the detailing. And I think that's what's fascinating. Then, of course, you can do things like Sandy did with
The Favourite.
The Favourite. But you can also see, if you squint, the draftsman's contract in that film, in the sense that you've got monochrome palette. I know Sandy's, we all grew up with that amazing film, 1982 Peter Greenaway film.
Yeah.
Everybody should watch the draftsman's contract. It is a purely fantastic silhouette, but they're made of calico. And they are the most fantastic visual costumes. So they're the perfect example of a twist, very simply made, but have this incredible cut. And I think the thing that I would put a little rider to those 2 points I've made about consistency and interest, but also its cut. If you can cut clothes well, that fit well, you could do them in bin liners. There is something about the cut that is supremely important, and too many things fall down because they are not made nicely enough.
And funnily enough, you touch on something that Tim and I were talking about just the other day, which is that, there was this explosion, and I think it's probably dating from about the late 60s through the 70s, certainly the 80s, of real looking costumes. If you think about the 50s with their 50s hairstyles, blue eyeshadow, big 50s shoulder pads, irrespective of period.
Yes.
But probably with the BBC and people like John Bloomfield, maybe Ray Hughes, Charles Node, John Peacock's silhouette book is a classic example of sort of one of the tools that people were then using.
Yes.
The emphasis was on getting costumes that looked authentic, that were of the correct period rather than the period that they were actually being made in.
I think it's very true. Yeah, I think it goes back to when I was at university. There was a huge rise. I was always very fond of music. And there was an enormous rise in what's called the early music system.
Yes.
And it was playing 17th and 18th century music on real instruments or faithful copies. So the big wire strings went. It's the same with period clothes. It was interesting when I first started at Bermans, you'd go down the rail and you'd see these clothes that were made from the late 60s. Mike O'Neill himself had worked at the RSC at Stratford in the making departments. And what was fascinating was that they had an emphasis on cut that was absolutely authentic, but they used a very interesting array of techniques to give the aged real look. If you watch The Six Wives of Henry VIII, you'll see that all the jewellery on it is sort of made of nuts and bolts.
It is.
And everything has sort of got bleached doily patterns over it that are like a mist. You can't quite tell. They're all fascinating techniques. I think we come back to these things. One of the finest films I've ever seen for period clothes is Jabberwocky. It is utterly fascinating.
Yeah.
And that's the last almost of that sort of 60s technique of breaking up the surface in a fascinating way with lots of relatively inexpensive techniques. And I think it was fascinating with Thrones, going back to that, was to call in all these ancient references from these different techniques over the decades. Some would have been much more important. We had a group of people called the Stone Men. They were completely 1960s technique of bleaching and doing all that sort of thing. And it was just, that's the great joy of costumes, that there are important reference points from all decades of interpretation. And it is a question of synthesizing the most interesting and relevant ones for the drama you're doing.
Yeah. Jabberwocky was Jim Atchison, wasn't it?
It was Hazel Pethig.
Was it?
Who was of the same school as Jim. I mean, that was the BBC era of the early 70s. And I just think it was their ambition and their creativity to use interesting fabrics. So if you look at a herald in Jabberwocky, you squint and he's got the four-quartered colours with arms on. But when you look closely, they're bits of rag and netting and twists of cord and nuts and bolts and stuff. And it's just brilliant.
Yeah, I think we are going to try and do a sort of a BBC special at some point, because we do all sincerely believe that training ground, that period of creativity that they had at that point, and not just BBC. I mean, the regions and some of the independents were making phenomenal productions. And you're right, The Six Wives of Henry, Howard Bird and I talked about that with John Bloomfield and Anne Beverley, you know, and the whole bleaching technique and all of those things. You're taking pieces of velvet and then bleaching into it to break it up and things. It's quite incredible.
Interesting also, though, that going back to the authentic thing is that if you then think, I think it was about 1987, Christine Edzard's Little Dorrit came out, and every single item of that film was made by hand in the original technique.
Yes.
So hand embroidery, hand stitching, every single thing. The cuts
by a guttering candle in
by
a
guttering candle somewhere in Rotherhithe, and it was. But I mean, a fascinating exercise again. Most important of all, and this is the thing that Mike taught me more than anything else, is that costume is drama. Of themselves, the items are, for me, of no interest whatsoever, unless they have a historical significance, like an officer's name in it or something like that. Yeah. But to me, they are only functioning as part of drama. And the trick is to make the clothes fit that drama within the whole brief of the whole show, and then you will get a thorough artistic project. Of themselves, I don't find them overly fascinating, but on people doing what they're meant to in the right style, it's just a thrill.
Well, and this chimes in very nicely with another little hobby horse of mine, which is, you know, costumed people in historical places. Now, it's true that you can barely walk around somewhere without some costumed lunatic coming out and trying to tell you what it was. You know, the lack of medical facilities.
Yes, which you can often tell from their aroma. Yeah.
Well, indeed. But I have always said, not necessarily with actual sort of living, breathing, speaking people, but putting costumed figures into, for example, Hampton Court when the Six Wives of Henry went in there, or you know some of those things that we've done in forts around and places, gives everything far more depth. So you're right, you're absolutely right that costumes on a rack, go through them and just that's nice, that's interesting. Costumes on a person, moving, speaking, doing things is it. You've mentioned obviously the you know where you started Costume House. How important is a costume house to the whole process for you?
It's interesting because in my time when I was at Bermans and Nathan's at the beginning, there were 150 staff. From front of house all the way down to
at one point, Alex, I think there were 250, but yeah.
Well, maybe actually. I mean, when we had the interregnum of when Laurie Holland came in with cost saving to be made, it went down to about 55, and then grew again when Tim took over. And I think that the interesting thing was I grew up pulling shows for customers. And as I say, I spent a lot of time doing continental shows. I went for about 5 years and never touched a British show. They would come over, they would have lists and incredible references. That was the fascination of working with them as well. They always brought amazing references.
Yes, they did.
So you would be left with lists, basically. I need 35 of these, 25 of those, 100 of those, how many of those? During the French Revolution era, when we did those shows, about 4 or 5 of them through 1988 onwards, we were often second selling the same clothes because they'd go from one show to another and come back and have a refurb or go in the dye pot and then go out again, which taught you a lot also about how to manage stock. Very vital lesson for people in the film business, I have to say. But fundamentally, we were entrusted with putting those films together. By the time I left Angels, it was much more that people like me or my era had left and were coming in hired by the productions to pull clothes for the show. So we were doing almost the same job, but paid by the production rather than the costume house. And that was a question of a natural course of events, I think. I don't know that could have been changed in any way. There was more work out there. People were getting to the certain age. I know I certainly felt that if I didn't go soon, I would never go to work freelance, so I jumped. I would say it's a shame in a way, because I think what you learned as an assistant on the floors, both knowing your stock back to front, good lesson for working on a film, because you know the stock you have on your film and what it's capable of. So lesson one. Lesson two, you know how to make it work if it's still on that guy on Thursday but needs to be on that guy on Monday with a change of medals. How do we do that? Who's going to be put in place? All of that stuff you learned in costume houses. I think it's still really important that the costume house plays that part. I just think that the way the thing is set up at the moment is that a lot of people come in to do all of that. And what you don't want is costume staff in the house to simply be booking out shows. You'd like them to be involved.
No, that's quite right. I mean, in fact, again, as a place to learn your shapes and learn your styles and learn your, learn the different classes and things. This is it. Or our costume house is it, because it's all there.
Yes.
And working on a film like Game of Thrones, may well give you a fantastic insight into what I'm loosely going to call, please forgive me, medieval world.
Yes.
But isn't actually particularly helpful if you then go on to a Victorian costume about how to tie a cravat properly.
I think that's very true. I think the wide variety of stuff I learnt in a costume house was fascinating, in the sense that, like I joked about it earlier, that we were somehow specialists doing period clothes. So you knew how to do chainmail and a Steinkirk. You knew how to do a barrel knot bow of 1840, and you knew how to curl a tricorn. It was but you'd done the tricorns because they'd previously been 17th century hats, and you needed more tricorns, so you converted them all. And then you deconverted them all because the next show was 17th century again. So I think you learnt the practicality. You learnt what was possible with stock. You learnt how to cheat a bit with period if necessary, as long as it fitted. Mike, you always used to tell me about colour palettes. If you get a relatively simple colour palette, you can sneak in things that aren't quite the right period without it being seen.
Yeah, providing they're within the same colour
palette.
You mean. Yes, absolutely. He always
used to say with the crowd, if you could do one spanker in 5, one absolute cracker in 5, in a crowd scene of 30 plus, you're in business. And that was brilliant when you didn't have that many clothes to work with. So you learnt a great deal of practicality.
Yes, yeah. I'm also intrigued by the fact that only you could use a word like interregnum to describe the time between Bermans and Angels in Camden.
Yes,
so splendid.
I think it was. It's just as well there isn't a statue, isn't there?
Well, it probably would end up in the river by now.
Daubed or something. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, listen, I think this has been really well. I've enjoyed it. I don't know about you.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Yes, and good, I think I hope that it's certainly a fascinating thing to have bridged. In my case, to have bridged quite a long era, in the sense that when I first worked in a costume house, there were people from a very early, like 2 generations before that, still working.
Yeah.
I feel very now having a much greater sense of the history of our business. I have a much greater pride in the fact that I was able to meet the Mr. Godenians, the George Bennetts, and many other people who were still around when I started. It also applies to the amazing, the international people I've met, the Carlo Pompeis, and all the people that I've had the privilege of working with in Italy and France over the years.
Yeah,
you develop a great sense of the thread of what it's all about, and I think it's unusual to be encouraged to speak about it, and it all comes flooding back in because take it for granted a lot of the time. So it's been a delight.
Well, I think it's great that for two of us who had no intention of ever working in this industry, in fact, really had no real appreciation of what this industry was. And this is again a thing that I keep harping on about. People take it for granted. I mean, I'm amazed that you actually stayed till the end of a production to watch the credits roll. Because, as you know, there's normally this. Again, I'm thinking of Mannering getting up from behind that cinema seat with his cap to one side and his glasses askew when they've all rushed out before the King was played.
That's right.
Now of course you've got a choice. You can either miss the last train and watch the credits, which seem to go on for about 20 minutes, or if it's on TV, you'll never see them anyway because they're flying by. But
they are, and I think what's fascinating also is the range of material. I mean, in those days, you could sit and, I suppose, watch the end credits because you had nothing to go back for. But nowadays, of course, no, because it was cinemas only and the odd television drama. Now the range and scope is endless. You'll flick from Netflix to HBO to whatever, and you will find something amazing, which has been wonderful for our business. Yes.
So I don't know whether they're going to roll any credits on this one, but Lord Fordham, I thank you so much for your time and your input to this, because, as I say, it's an important part. You're a great fella. I love working with you in the sense that it's always fun. I always learn things, and we have a laugh, don't we? We
do. Likewise, it's a marvelous. I think that's the joy of it. I've come across some of the most fantastic people one could ever meet, and to have a working relationship with them is thrilling. So thank you. It's been brilliant fun.
So that was Alex. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
The question, I was glad he brought up about the Six Wives of Henry VIII, because that's always something we've always pointed to about how clever it is. And there are costumes knocking around the warehouse that have the nuts and bolts all spray painted gold and silver all stuck on them. And it's amazing when you look at them close up, it looks like it is, but on camera, as Alex said, it looks phenomenal.
No, and again, this comes out in the Howard Burden interview, because Howard worked on some of those. The connection, Jonathan is obviously, John Bloomfield and Beverly Winwood. They are. It was an extraordinarily clever and innovative way of doing things. It's a bit like those plastic lace collars that were kicking around after restoration. Do you remember?
Oh, that Jim printed. Yeah, but that's a lot to do with understanding the technicalities of cameras and lighting and filming, and it's actually, I think it's a slightly different process these days. I think that with high definition.
Well, I think it is, and of course, Jeremy says about John's costumes still existing, and yes, they do, but they're extraorinarily of their time, and they don't blend with anything. And those rubber lace
don't often get used.
No, those rubber lace collars have basically gone. They worked. They worked for that very well. And as we keep going on, we're all to do about longevity and legacy, and we buy 2020 costumes because in 20 years' time they're going to be period. So things that are quick fixes that work for particular productions don't always work for us.
No, and also is with what Alex said about period with a twist. And if that's where we're going at the moment, in 20 years, people might not want period costumes with a twist, which means the longevity for us, or as a costume house, we have to figure a way of amending those costumes.
Yeah.
Well, we ride with the trends, don't we?
The next interview we're going to be releasing is Jonathan's with Annie Simons.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to that.
It would be interesting because Annie has had many, many, many years of experience on so many different levels of production, small, low budget to massive, internationally produced TV. Is it extraterrestrial when it's not terrestrial drama?
Well, I don't know. Phone home.
Calling occupants of interplanetary
Earth.
That's the first time I've heard streaming or satellite TV described as extraterrestrial.
Well, she was in very early at the whole music video thing, wasn't she, Jonathan? Does that come out?
Yeah, we chat about those connections, of which still that's, if you like, that's the backbone of her introduction, and a lot of her inspiration and process comes from that time.
I was trying to find that one of isn't there one where she's on a riverboat?
The Coma Chameleon.
Oh,
Yes. Well, you see, the thing is, Jeremy, that because these things were fairly low budget, they just called in everybody that they could. So you'll see mates in these things. I mean, the Adamant Stand and Deliver one's got Dave Whiting sort of playing the fop in the carriage, complete with Walkman headphones on it. It's a very weird thing. And so they'd use the crew just as crowd extras, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to find for you, Richard, the game of consequence between Alex and Annie. I will have it by the time we record the intro to Annie's next week, but then I'm sure there is one.
Yeah.
And here's a small excerpt from Jonathan's chat with Annie.
A lot of what I do is court dialogue, so I can hear voices that aren't just my own banging in my head. But, the creative process is about the exchange you have with a maker, with a dyer, with where that could go, where you don't have time to think it through. They can bring stuff to the table. And if they're clever, if they're creative, if they've got their own thing going, they can contribute.